Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing my 24-25 third quarter grades for the San Jose Sharks. Now, as per usual, it is very important to mention that these are not grades given out to the players who I thought were the best on the team down to the worst. That would be as though I was saying that Shakir Mukhamadullin was a better defenseman than Jake Walman, which is obviously not the case. Instead, these are grades given to the players based on their individual preseason expectations. And starting off at the top of this list, we have Sharks forward Will Smith. Now, teams are always hopeful that their rookies can come into the NHL and immediately make a huge impact, be dominant, carry that through an entire season, finish it off strong, and all is well and good. But outside of a few special talents like Macklin Celebrini, this just isn't a very realistic expectations. Most young players will go through the ups and downs and the bumps and bruises of a full 82-game season. At that point, optimistically, you're hoping that they will just have a general trend upwards throughout the year instead of stagnating or even worse, trending downwards. And this is exactly what Will Smith has managed to do. He looks like an entirely different player here in Game 61 than he did back in October during Game 1. At the beginning of the season, Smith wasn't even really NHL caliber. He didn't play with the necessary pace or urgency to find success at the highest level, and he certainly didn't have the strength to do so either. The only reason he actually managed to maintain a spot in the NHL lineup was simply because the Sharks were choosing to keep him in that position. If it was purely based on merit, he would have been sent down after the preseason, where he had a very underwhelming performance. Another young player who was playing on the Sharks around this time, Daniil Gushchin, had actually outperformed Will Smith at pretty much every single turn, and yet he would get sent down to the Barracuda in favor of leaving Smith up with the main team because of that 4th overall draft pick pedigree. Now, as the time went on, he would have these kind of flash in the pan moments during games where he'd make like a nice play or two. That was decent to see, and by the end of the first quarter, I would give him a very generous grade of a C+. It was the second quarter where we started to see those strides forward. Now, instead of just singular moments in particular games, he'd actually have solid 60-minute efforts. They were pretty few and far between. He might have like 1 or 2 good games, then 3 or 4 relatively low-impact ones, but it was still progress being made. But it has truly been this third quarter where things have completely taken off for him. In the 20 games he has played, 15 points scored during that time. And if you shorten the sample size a little bit, since his homecoming game against the Boston Bruins, he has played 14 and put up 13 points over that time span. That is amongst the league leaders in terms of NHL rookies. He has been very impressive since then, and just 13 points in 14 games, that's already really good, but the amount of offense that he has been generating, he could have even more than that if he himself was able to finish on the chances he got, or his teammates were able to finish on the chances he was generating for them. That's how effective Will Smith has been from an offensive perspective. But even from a defensive perspective, it should be noted that in these last 14 games, Will Smith has been a even or positive player in almost every single one of them. The only exception being yesterday against the Ottawa Senators, where he ended up being a -2, being on the ice for that empty net goal against and the shorthanded goal against. But prior to that, when Will Smith was on the ice, the Sharks were outscoring their opponents at even strength. And for a team that during that time frame won just a singular game in 14, that is very, very impressive. And so Smith ends up with one of the best grades here out of any player, an A-, which it bodes exceptionally well for the future. Most people believed, including myself, that we would really only see these big strides in Smith's games going into next year after a strong off-season of training and getting stronger. The fact that he is already doing it this year, very, very promising. Then we move on to Sharks defenseman Henry Thrun, definitely one of the more frustrating players on this team. There are times where Thrun can have a really, really great outing where he looks extremely confident. He's making plays in his own zone to relieve pressure, not necessarily doing a ton offensively, but doing enough responsibly in his own zone that you're thinking maybe in 3 years' time, he could be a solid second pairing defenseman for this team. But then the very next game, he'll look like an entirely different player. Well, suddenly he will be more panicky, more hesitant, and making just terrible plays in his own zone, poor execution, out of position, and suddenly he's a huge liability in his own zone where 3 years' time you might not even think he'll be an NHL player. And he is consistently oscillating between those high highs and the low lows. It's not unheard of for a young player to be inconsistent, but usually they'll go from like pretty good to pretty bad. For Thrun, it's like amazing to really, really bad. And that is just not good enough for a defenseman at the NHL level. It should be noted that while he is a young player, he's no longer considered to be a rookie at this point. This is his second season here in the NHL. You need to be able to lock some things down a little bit. There needs to be more confidence coming into Henry Thrun's game. And the fact is that this past quarter, there's been a lot more of those lows than there has been of those highs. And so his grade, which had previously been kind of just like a C plus, has now dropped a little bit down to a D plus. The good news, I guess, Thrun has looked a bit better, though now injured after the Four Nations tournament, but he really needs to figure some things out here. He had signed a 2-year prove-it contract this past off-season. He hasn't really been yet to prove it. Then we move on to Sharks forward Luke Kunin. He has the steepest drop-off of any player that I will be giving a grade to in this video, going from a very strong B in the second quarter down to now the almost worst, actually it is the worst out of any player, at a D. And this is because Luke Kunin defensively, I mean, he had never really been all that great. The fact is that Ryan Warsofsky continues to trust him in certain situations to like hold on to a lead and things like that, even though Kunin has done very little to prove he's capable of doing exactly that. Perhaps that is one of the reasons for why the Sharks have really struggled to hold on to their leads, because they're overusing Kunin in these types of situations. So defensively, he's still not all that great, but the offense that was once looked at as being pretty solid in the previous quarter, he had 9 points, including 7 goals, has almost completely dried up. In the 20 games that he has played in this quarter, he has just 2 points during that time span. And this is not for a lack of ice time. This is not Kunin playing now like 7 or 8 minutes and you expect his point totals to have dropped. He is still playing a ton of minutes, at least relative to his usual self, like 15, 16 plus minutes of time on ice, getting good amount of even strength play, and yet 2 points, that's just simply not good enough. And so for a player who the Sharks are probably looking to shop around a little bit, not really doing himself a lot of favors, I'll give him the grade of a D. It really hasn't been good. Then we move on to Fabian Zetterlund, one of the more peculiar players on this list, because usually the way I work with this is that I'll give these I'll think about how they've done over the last 20 games and I'll give them a tentative grade, and then I'll look at their stats and see how that supports it and then make changes accordingly. And for Zetterlund, I thought back and I said, there really haven't been that many exciting outings for Zetterlund, and a player who plays in the top 6 and has had moments with Granlund throughout this quarter, with a resurging Wennberg and a surging Will Smith, he should be doing better than he actually is. And so I had originally given him the grade of a C, but then I took a look at the stats and they actually paint a slightly different picture. He has about 8 points over these 20 games that he has played, which is not great, but it should be noted that Zetterlund does not play on the first power play unit, which could easily add like 2, 3, 4 more points for him, which would make it look a lot better. So 8 points, 20 games, not the end of the world. On top of that, Fabian Zetterlund is one of the very, very few plus players during this quarter for the Sharks. And as I mentioned, if you're only winning 3 games out of 20, being a plus player during that time is not an easy thing to do, and yet he has managed to accomplish exactly that. And if you take a look at some of the more advanced stats, while they do agree that Zetterlund has very rarely been a huge impact player for San Jose, he is usually on the positive side of things. And so with all of that, it felt as though I did kind of need to increase his grade, but I can't justify putting it any further than the B- he already had previously, because the eye test just does not support him. What I have seen from Zetterlund, it feels as though more so in the future that he's kind of like a third liner instead of the second liner that the Sharks are currently using him in that position. He just doesn't really seem to have that possibility of driving a line in that top 6, even when playing with really solid players. But in the end, he seems to be relatively responsible at the very least, so he does get that B-. Then we move on to Alex Wennberg, kind of like with Fabian Zetterlund, a very even keel player throughout much of this season. The first quarter I gave him a B-, the second quarter I gave him a C+, and it seemed as though he would be well on his way to another B- here. But the big turnaround for Wennberg has happened post Four Nations break, finally getting into a position where he's actually playing with some really talented individuals. Because of Celebrini and Granlund being the top 2 centers for so long, Wennberg was always that third line guy, meaning most of his wingers were Luke Kunin, Barclay Goodrow, Goodrow, Dellandrea, Klim Kostin, not exactly the best of the best in terms of offensive talent. And so Wennberg, outside of like power play opportunities or in the overtime, he didn't really have a lot of moments to show off his offensive prowess. But now with Granlund gone, he comes up to the second line. Smith is on fire. Zetterlund is at least a decent complementary piece. Wennberg has suddenly had the opportunity to look a lot better, and he has taken that opportunity and ran with it. And so this is maybe a little bit of recency bias coming into play here, but I'm excited to see what Wennberg will be able to do during the final stretch of this season, and I'll augment his grade a little bit up to a B. Then we move on to Barclay Goodrow, and while the Sharks only had 3 wins over their last 20 games, they did manage to have the biggest win of the season, with Ryan Warsofsky finally coming to the realization that we all did back in the early parts of October, that Barclay Goodrow is not a top 6 player, that he should not be playing with Will Smith and Macklin Celebrini, that he should not even be a top 9 player, and instead belongs more so in a 4th line role where he can find his success on the penalty kill, which is really the only part of the game that he's actually still good at. So give him like 6-7 minutes of even strength ice time, and that will be perfectly fine for him. Warsofsky has started to actually do so. It has kind of fallen off a little bit as of late because the Sharks, they're having some injuries and they're moving players in trades that obviously somebody does have to play up in the lineups, and so Goodrow has found himself in a 3rd line role these last couple of games, but at the very least he's not being forced into those positions for absolutely no reason. When it comes to his actual play here, it's been, about as you would expect. There's not much doing. His 4th line position, his 4th line play isn't amazing or anything like that, so his grade is going to reflect that. But now that he is in a well more suited role for himself, he gets a better C-. Now there was a stat from a few weeks ago that I did see that I think it was based on like expected goals for and expected goals against, that statistically Barclay Goodrow was by far the worst player in the NHL. I can certainly believe that, but we know that Warsofsky is incapable of healthy scratching him, so if he has to stay in the lineup, at least it's usually as a 4th liner. Then we move on to Timothy Liljegren. Kind of like with Henry Thrun, there's a lot of ups and downs in Liljegren's game, but it is kind of for the opposite reason. Thrun, it seems as though there's maybe a lack of confidence. With Liljegren, it's almost an overconfidence at times. He tries to play a very aggressive game at the defensive zone blue line, stepping up in the neutral zone, and he frequently ends up finding himself getting burned because of that, as well as the fact that at times he can also be a little too nonchalant. It feels as though he's just not really putting a lot of urgency into the plays that he's making, and the other teams are able to capitalize because of that very fact. But it is not just the inconsistencies on the defensive end that has made Liljegren not really have a great grade here, but it's also the fact that he's just not really providing much offensively. And for a player who was brought in to actually be a bit of an offensive force, not anything amazing, but at least put up some points, this is just not a great look for him. He has just 3 points over this quarter. That is less than what Mario Ferraro has, who is not viewed as any sort of offensive capability. So the fact that Liljegren here is down with just 3 points during that time, not the best look for sure. And so he ends up maintaining the grade he had last quarter at a D+. Then we move on to Mario Ferraro. He didn't start off this year particularly well. He was paired with Jan Rutta for a good bit, and so his grade was really bad at the beginning of the season. The second quarter, it saw some improvements at a D+, but this quarter it does see a pretty good jump as Ferraro has started to find a little bit more consistency in his game as of late, and especially since the return from the Four Nations break. Now, it's still not amazing, and he does still have a tendency to make these egregious errors, and especially in certain games where the Sharks as a whole have looked really, really bad. Ferraro is a part of that, considering just the amount of minutes that he does eat up. But the big thing about Ferraro is that he does a lot of good things in his own zone. The only issue that he does have is the actual defense. And so if he can manage to figure that out, the fact that he is a player who can block shots, who is physical, who's not afraid to really get into it with other players, who can eat up a ton of minutes, and then if he can shore up the defensive play, he can actually be a very effective player for the San Jose Sharks moving forward, or for any team, depending on if the Sharks decide to trade him away. So his grade is still not great. I've been singing his praises a little bit in this, but it's still not an amazing output. He ends up with a C+. Then we move on to the goaltender Alexander Georgiev, actually the only goalie who I will be giving a grade 2 in this one. The reason for that is Vanacek just did not play enough games. He was injured for a long bit, and then Askarov is no longer up with the Sharks. He's still with the San Jose Barracuda, so Georgiev is the only one who has played a good handful of games. He actually has about 10 of them, and he really hasn't been all that great. I believe his save percentage is like a .885 during this time span, if I calculated that correctly. His goal save above expected is also pretty deep into the negatives. There have been a couple of solid outings for him back at the beginning of the quarter, and then most recently against like Calgary, but the major problem with Georgiev is even in the games where he does play pretty well, there's always at least one goal that he lets in that you're thinking he definitely should have been able to make the save there, and that creates a lot of kind of poor confidence in him from the team playing in front. When you have a really good goaltender, it's not simply just about making the saves that are necessary, but it's also because the team is aware that their goaltender is good enough that they can play a bit more of a free style, knowing that if there is a mistake being made, their goalie can cover for it. But when you're in a situation where you don't have the confidence in your goaltender to make the saves necessary, suddenly you kind of tighten up a little bit and you try to play a little bit too perfect. And as we know, the saying goes, perfect is the enemy of good, and that ends up just creating more chances the opposite way and more goals against for Georgiev. So it hasn't been an absolutely horrific, terrible, irredeemable stretch of games for Georgiev. He's had some decent outings, but the fact is that it's just not really been good enough, and so he ends up with a D+. Then we move on to Mark-Edouard Vlasic, one of two players on this list who didn't actually play 10 of the 20 games that I usually require to actually be given a grade here, but because of the fact that I wanted to not just review 16 players in this case, and I'll bump it up to 18, and the fact that Vlasic, he's a long-time Shark, might as well talk about him. He came in and was immediately pretty good to start this season. I believe the Sharks won their first 3 games when he was in the lineup, the first of which was not part of this quarter, but the next 2 were, so that was pretty good to see. However, besides that, Vlasic has then been more so like kind of average, and I was perfectly fine with giving him the grade of like a C, maybe a C+ if I was feeling somewhat generous. The thing is, however, is that Vlasic did have one outing against the Florida Panthers, one that I referenced in the game that when I was talking about Henry Thrun, which was just an absolute disaster. He looked really, really bad in that one, and since Vlasic has only played 9 games this quarter, that it has a pretty outsized effect on what your perspective about him, and as such he ends up with a slightly worse grade of a C-. Then we move on to Colin Graf. He has had kind of 2 different sets of games here for the Sharks. His first call-up where he played maybe 10 or so games, then he was sent down for a couple of weeks, and then he came back up and played about 7 or so more. Now, in this case, the first part, he was getting a lot of big minutes with guys like Celebrini and Smith and Granlund and Zetterlund, and he really wasn't doing much with that ice time. Offensively, he wasn't producing all that well. Defensively, he was doing some decent things, but when you're playing in that top 6 role, you want to see some offense. It didn't really happen, so I wasn't all that surprised when Graf would end up getting sent back down. The second call-up, however, he has looked a good bit better, playing more so in kind of a bottom 6 role. However, he has managed to find his first career goal that he scored against the Montreal Canadiens, and he's been playing a lot better on the Sharks' penalty kill, which has seen a bit of a resurgence, perhaps because of his presence there. He's actually ended up getting a lot of ice time as well, even when playing in that bottom 6 role, because the Sharks have decided to elect to use him in certain defensive situations, and have been a much bigger fan of Colin Graf as of late. He is even managing to create a little bit of offense for himself here and there, like we saw in his setup for the Nico Sturm goal the other night against the Montreal Canadiens as well. So Colin Graf definitely much better in this second call-up than in the first one, so he ends up with a decent grade of a B-. Then we move on to Ty Dellandrea. He's a player who I've kind of just come to the conclusion here is just pretty average. You know exactly what you're going to get from Ty Dellandrea. Comes out on the ice, he throws his body around physically. Maybe he'll get a chance or 2 here or there, but realistically, you're just gonna kind of like the fact that he's playing with a lot of energy, right? And so through this quarter, he had just 2 points. There's nothing to write home about, but again, the expectations, they're not particularly high for him, and so he ends up with a C. Then we move on to Macklin Celebrini, and unsurprisingly, Celebrini did lead all Sharks players in terms of points, 17 in 20 games. This is actually a slightly below where he was at in the previous quarter, where he managed to be point per game pace with 22 in 21 games. So that is a slight downturn. This is likely due to the fact that he started this quarter on a little bit of a cold streak for himself, 3 or 4 games in a row where he just wasn't his usual strong performing player. But of course, since then, he's started to once more be like a consistent top 3, top 4 player in every single game. Usually he's even just the Sharks' best forward on any given night. The points are flowing, the chances are flowing. He probably could have more than 17 if not for a couple of robbery type of situations from other teams' goaltenders. And so there's not really a lot of negative to be said about Celebrini. The only thing, however, is, again, I mentioned the offense did drop a little bit, and also defensively there has been some suspect moments, but he still ends up with one of the best grades here, tied with his buddy Will Smith at an A-. Then we move on to William Eklund, line mate of Macklin Celebrini, who had the second most points during this quarter, 16 in 20 games. The only reason that I have Eklund below a guy like Will Smith, for instance, in terms of grade here, is that my expectations for Eklund are a decent bit higher. I hope that he's able to come out and be a really dynamic player, and there have been some games this quarter where he has managed exactly that, where he has been a top 2, top, sometimes even best player for the San Jose Sharks. I am hoping to see a little bit more consistency in that regard. There have also been a decent chunk of games where it feels as though he is lagging behind his line mate, in particular Macklin Celebrini. Should that be much of a surprise? Maybe not. Celebrini is obviously incredibly talented, and maybe you shouldn't have the expectation that Eklund would be as good as him, but it just feels as though there could be a little bit more. Still, his grade, very, very solid. Third best on the team, B+. Then we move on to the final line mate here, Tyler Toffoli, kind of a peculiar type of player in the same vein as a Fabian Zetterlund, but the difference being is that Toffoli does have the point totals to back it up. He's played, I just believe, only 17 games during this quarter, and he has 13 points during that time span. Now, it's a little different and a bit of a apples to oranges type of comparison, because Toffoli does play the Sharks' top power play, and he does play with Macklin Celebrini, which are two advantages that Zetterlund does not have, but still, he is the Sharks' leading scorer. He's managing to put up these points, even if he's not always the best of the best player on any given night. So I'll give him a pretty good grade, but not amazing, of a B. Then we move on to Jan Rutta. It might be a little bit of surprise that Jan Rutta is even getting reviewed in the first place here, but he has technically played 10 games this quarter. It seems like longer because of those 2 weeks off for the Four Nations, but indeed, he barely makes the cutoff point. The thing about Jan Rutta is that even at his best, he's like barely average, and then at his worst, he's simply not very good, and he's been more so at his worst than at his best throughout these 10 games that he did play. It's not terrible, but it's not particularly good either. He ends up with a D+. Then we move on to Shakir Mukhamadullin. Like with Colin Graf, it's been sort of a tale of 2 seasons for him. He had a few games prior to the Four Nations break and then 4 games post Four Nations break, and he's looked somewhat different between them. The first stretch of games, he was okay, trying some offensive things, sometimes getting a little bit abused on the defensive side of things. If I had to have given him a grade just on those 5 games, I would have said a C. Then in the post-Four Nations break, however, he's looked a decent bit better, somewhat more settled in, found a little bit of a home on a pairing with Mario Ferraro, who has obviously looked really good as of late, and as such, Mukhamadullin has reflected also looking pretty good as of late, and so his grade does go up a bit. It is kind of like with Mark-Edouard Vlasic, where even just 1 or 2 games, because you've only played 9 in this sample size, does affect you quite considerably, and so I give him a B-. And then finally, we have Sharks defenseman Jake Walman, the only other player who had a massive drop-off, like with Luke Kunin, is Walman, who goes from an A- all the way down to a C. You see, this quarter started off with Walman actually injured. He did not play the first couple of games, and then when he did return, it seemed as though he wasn't actually fully healthy. Defensively, he had taken a massive downturn. He started to be a liability quite consistently in his own zone, which was something that we occasionally saw back at the beginning of the year, but not all that often. But his offense also fell off a cliff completely. In the previous quarter, he had put up 14 points. In this one, he has just 5. That is a quite steep drop-off, and considering Walman Walman was viewed as like the main offensive defenseman for the Sharks, and he continues to get top power play minutes for them. The fact that he only managed 5 points during this time is not all that great. Now, at the beginning of the season, Walman was viewed as like a potential MVP candidate for this team because of the stark difference that he made on the back end for the Sharks compared to last season where they had literally nobody to provide any sort of offense. It's hard to say that Walman is still in the running for that. Luckily, post Four Nations break, with those 2 weeks off, Walman seems to have recovered a good amount, and now he's looking a lot better in these last 4 games that he has played since then. Hopefully that can carry into the final stretch here. We shall see, but right now I couldn't justify giving Walman anything higher than the average of a C. But that will do it for these grades. Obviously, a lot of them are somewhat lower than where they were at in the previous one. It should not be that much of a surprise. The Sharks, as I mentioned already multiple times, they won 3 games over this 20-game time span. That is very, very bad. And so, again, you expect these types of outcomes, but there are still some bright spots here, and hopefully the fourth quarter goes maybe a little bit better. Class dismissed.